we are going live, and I think we should be ready in a few moments. Yes, we are live. Professor Friston, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction and summary of my talk. You've almost summarized my talk completely. So it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'm going to talk about, indeed, Markov blankets and the free energy principle. I think it's useful to start by acknowledging that this is a very coarse-grained and ambitious account of self-organization, particularly in sentient systems. So I'm going to tell a story that effectively is aspiring to provide a physics of sentience, but it shouldn't be taken too seriously. And particularly, you don't need to take notes. It's highly unlikely that any of the material that I'm going to be talking about is going to appear in any exam questions or future work. So please take this as a bit of fun that comes derives from considering problems in the life sciences, in particular sentient behavior, from the perspective of a physicist. So it's broad in its scope and hopefully pertinent for a science society. So what I'm going to do is start off by considering the statistics of life, and I'm going to focus in particular on the notion of Markov blankets and how a particular kind of mechanics arises from Markov blankets, specifically Bayesian mechanics, or mechanics of inference and sense making. I'll try and demonstrate the basic phenomenology using simulations of a little primordial soup. And then I'm going to tell exactly the same story, but as if I was talking to cognitive scientists or psychologists. So the same story from the point of view of a brain making sense of its sensory data. And that story is going to be told in the context of predictive coding and the neuronal dynamics that we see in neuronal and indeed neural networks in machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then if we had time, I'm going to conclude with a special focus on the active part of sentient behavior, the behavioral part, and ask the question, if we understand the nature of self-organization in terms of a Bayesian mechanics, what does that tell us about the different ways in which we can understand the imperatives that underwrite our behavior and our actions? And I'm going to try and highlight two different ways that we can choose our actions and thereby sample the right kind of data. So I'm going to start with a question posed by Schrödinger. How can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry? And I want to pick up on this notion of a spatial boundary, because it is necessary in terms of discriminating or delineating something from everything else to specify how that thing or the states of something can be separated or identified independently from the states of the universe in which it is immersed. So I'm going to read the Markov boundary as something called a Markov blanket, as a statistical boundary, a probabilistic boundary, the nature of which Schrödinger would be the first to acknowledge. Now, if I was there in person, I'd be asking somebody in the front row to tell me if they knew what a Markov blanket is, but I won't do that. I'll pretend somebody is there and they give you an expert description of what a Markov blanket is, and then I will summarize what they said. So a Markov blanket effectively is just a subset of some states in some abstract state space that enables you to separate things on the inside of the blanket from things on the outside. So I've cartooned the notion here with this, what's called a graphical model of states, where each of these little circles corresponds to a particular state in some small universe, where the edges or the arrows denote the influence of one state on another state. And to understand the construction of a Markov blanket, we first of all have to identify some states, and we'll call them internal states. They're internal states to a particle. That particle could be a person, or it could be a small particle, or indeed a virus. Now, the Markov blanket are defined in terms of the parents, the children, and the parents of the children of the internal states. So these blanket states effectively insulate statistically the inside from the outside. So mathematically, what that means is that if I wanted to know the evolution or dynamics of my states, my internal states, given the rest of the universe, I would only need to know these insulating or blanket states here. Every bit of information about the entire universe is contained in these blanket states in relation to how my states will evolve in time. I'm going to make a further move here and partition the blanket states into two sets. The first set is characterized by an influence on the internal states, but the internal states do not influence these states, and we'll call these sensory states for reasons which will become clear on the next slide. Similarly, the internal states influence but are not influenced by active states. So together, the sensory and the active states comprise the blanket states, and if I now include the internal states that are enshrouded by the blanket states, I can call these the states of a particle or a person, or more generally, particular states. So you may be asking, why have I called these things sensory and active states? Well, if you just think about structures in the world, and I've given two cardinal structures here, a brain and a single-celled organism, it is always the case that you can divide or partition the states according to this Markov blanket and bipartition the Markov blanket into active and sensory states. So, for example, we could associate all the states of the brain with internal states. The active states would then become our actuators, our autonomic reflexes, our muscles that are influenced by the internal states, and in turn change the outside world, change the external states. And these external states then affect or influence the sensory states, our sensory organs, our sensory epithelia, that then influence the internal states, cause changes inside our brain, and so the cycle continues. And this particular set of influences induces exactly that conditional independence that defines the Markov blanket. And those conditional independencies are exactly the same you see, for example, in a single-celled organism. We can consider the intracellular states, the internal states. The active states could be the actin filaments that support the sensory or surface states, S, with sensory receptors that are pushed, the surface being pushed out into the external milieu, changing external states that then reciprocate their coupling by influencing cell surface receptors that change the internal states again. So wherever you look, if you can identify a particle or a creature, it must be equipped with this partition of states and this particular set of conditional dependencies that are underwritten by these influences. So having introduced the notion of a Markov blanket, what I'd like you to do now is to forget about the Markov blanket. What we're going to do is just briefly rehearse the physics of self-organization. And then we're going to put the Markov blanket back into play and see what special properties emerge and how we can interpret the behavior of particles that are equipped with a Markov blanket. So let me just back up a bit and just consider some arbitrary system, some random dynamical system. I've cartooned one here in terms of the evolution of two of its many states here, and plotted them in the state space, state 1, state 2, as a function of time. And the kind of systems that we're interested in are those that have an attracting set, or to put it another way, the systems that occupy a small number of states in relation to the total possible number of states that they could occupy. So they're space filling, but they actually have a characteristic attracting set, which effectively draws the trajectory to within that set or within that manifold. So you can think of this as operating at any time scale. For example, it could be fast oscillations in a biological cell. It could be the fluctuations of my heart during the cardiac cycle. It could be me getting up in the morning, having a cup of coffee, doing my emails, and going through my daily cycle. It could be an annual cycle with Christmas and Easter. The key thing is that any system that has characteristic states that are conserved over a sufficient period of time will always keep revisiting the neighborhood of previous states that belong to this attracting set. And that's basically what I mean by a random dynamical system that possesses a Markov blanket, but to possess a Markov blanket, it has to have this attracting set in play. Just technically, you can describe this as a Langevin formulation of a random dynamical system with states evolving with time. That's what the dot means. As a function of where they are, there's a flow here, plus some random fluctuations, omega here. A nice interpretation of this is that it can be described as or it is a description of me as I evolve at some particular time scale, but also it can be interpreted as a probability you will find me in any particular state when I'm sampled at a random point in time. So we can also regard the density of these trajectories in terms of the probability of finding me in this particular point in state space X, given me, given the attracting set in question. And that interpretation is very important because it enables us to use standard physics to write down the evolution or the density dynamics, not in terms of the changes in the states, but in terms of the changes in the probability distribution over the states, so to my p dot here. And I can write it down as a function of the amplitude of random fluctuations gamma and the flow, the state-dependent flow f here. So this is known as a Fokker-Planck equation. It's not important, if you don't know this, if you're from the biological sciences, don't worry about the maths. It's a very generic equation. Some people might know it as a master equation, others might know it as a Schrodinger equation. The key thing from our point of view is that we are interested in a special kind of system that keeps itself to these attracting sets of states. And that means that after a sufficient period of time, this change in the probability distribution will be zero. And if this part is zero, we can say that this equation has a solution. And if it has a solution, that tells us something quite remarkable. It tells us that there are certain constraints on the flow at any point in state space, the dynamics of the system. And I've written that out here in terms of something called the Helmholtz decomposition as a mixture of gradient flows, where this gradient operator here operates on the log probability or the potential, the negative potential afforded by this probability distribution here. And I've split it into two, known as a dissipative and a conservative or solenoidal flow here, and that's basically, that splitting is the decomposition. So what I've been able to do is, if anything has a solution to the Fokker-Planck equation, has a steady state or non-equilibrium steady state solution from the physicist's point of view, then I can always write down its dynamics or flows in terms of a gradient flow on this quantity here, this log probability of these states being occupied. For people who don't do physics, let me just unpack that slightly more intuitively. Imagine that I placed a drop of ink in a glass of water. Now, systems that don't have this attracting set will behave in the usual way. They will dissipate as the random fluctuations, molecular fluctuations, disperse the molecules of ink throughout the solvent. I would expect to see the ink diffuse throughout the container. However, we're not interested in that kind of system. We're interested in systems that effectively gather themselves up again, that they are drawn to this attracting set and have a kind of homeostasis or self-assembly. And that self-assembly is written by effectively diffusing up, flowing up concentration gradients. And that's effectively what this Helmholtz decomposition is saying. All it's saying is that for the system to gather itself up again, to keep itself within the neighborhood of the states it characteristically finds itself in, there must be two kinds of flow. The first flow is this gradient flow that depends upon the amplitude of the random fluctuations that are trying to disperse the ink molecules in this example. So that the gradient flow is exactly countering the dispersion until we reach this non-equilibrium steady state. And that just leaves the orthogonal flow on the isocontours of this potential here, or the log probability here, that flow around effectively in circles in this example, hence solenoidal flow. So that's all that this is saying, that if something gathers itself together, then it must be describable with this decomposition of its dynamics. And crucially, the self-organizing aspect is driven both by a gradient flow here that's countering random fluctuations and the solenoidal flow. And you'll all be familiar with this mixture of flows, just watching water go down a plug hole. The gradient flow going down and the solenoidal flow encircling the plug hole. So that's the basic physics I wanted to bring to the table. Just a note here for the physicists in the audience, that gradient flow and the underlying Fokker-Planck equation can at a coarse grain level be seen to be the foundation of all of physics. And in particular, we can see it, different kinds of physics arising from limiting cases of this Helmholtz decomposition. So, for example, what could we change? Well, we could change the amplitude of the random fluctuations. We could look at very, very big things where the random fluctuations are averaged away, and that gamma effectively disappears. And then we're just left with the solenoidal flow. And effectively, that leaves us with conservative systems that have no dissipation due to the random fluctuations. Now, if I just write out a particular form, functional form for the solenoidal flow, we get effectively Newton's laws of motion, or more generally, Lagrangian mechanics. So we can look at this Helmholtz decomposition as embracing all of classical mechanics, simply as a limiting case that there aren't many random fluctuations. I can go to the other extreme and say that the random fluctuations are so evident that we can ignore the solenoidal flow. And in this instance, we recover basically fluctuation dissipation theorems that underwrite statistical and stochastic mechanics, thermodynamics. I can make a small move here and express this probability density as the complex root of a wave function here. And then this equation here effectively becomes a time-independent Schrodinger equation. And from that, I can derive all of quantum electrodynamics. So the idea here is that there's a really important foundation for much of physics that inherits from this decomposition of systems that have attracting sets. Now, what we're going to do is put the Markov blanket back into the game and see if there are any special properties. And the special properties that rest upon exactly the same assumptions as classical statistical and quantum mechanics derive from simply having a Markov blanket. So that's what the rest of the talk is going to be about, basically. And if you remember, what basically happens here is that if the Markov blanket insulates the internal states from the outside states, and the outside states don't influence the active states, that means that the internal active states of anything can always be written down as a potential function that does not involve the outside or the external state. So my internal states, the way I act, can always be expressed as a function of my blanket states and my internal states. And I'm going to tell a story basically about a particular functional interpretation of this potential that derives simply because you've got a Markov blanket. Right, so what about the Markov blanket? Well, here's our decomposition. Here's the equivalent decomposition written out separately for the internal states and the active states. And what I'm going to do is associate the dynamics, this gradient flow or solenoidal generalized gradient flow of the internal states with perception and the corresponding flow of the active states as action, noting crucially that they both will be appearing to perform a gradient flow on the same quantity optimizing, if you like, the same quantity. So what is that quantity? Well, it's the log of the probability of my sensory exchange with the environment, the blanket states given I am me. And this has a number of interpretations depending upon your field of inquiry or the discipline in which you're working. So if you were in psychology and doing the psychology of behavior through the lens of reinforcement learning, then this thing would basically be reward or value. It would basically be the kind of states I expect to find myself in, that I am warm, sated, loved, happy, and everything else that provides evidence that I am this kind of thing. So this potential now, which will be, which we're going to equate with this negative, this log probability is going to be equated with a negative potential or a free energy, and we'll unpack that later. This quantity now just scores the value of being in any given state, because it is literally part of an attracting set. It's an attractive set. It's an attractive state of being, which is inherently valuable to things like me. So from that, we can spin off reinforcement learning, optimal control theory in engineering, or indeed expected utility theory in economics. Now, if you were doing information theory, then you would not read this as value. You would read the negative log probability of some, say, blanket data as a self-information or surprisal, or more simply surprise. It just scores the improbability of finding myself in this particular state. And thereby, or therefore, you can then interpret these dynamics as trying to minimize surprise, which is the same as maximizing value. And from an information theoretic perspective, you can then spin off the principle of maximum mutual information between the inside and the outside, or the Infomax principle, also cast in terms of principles of minimum redundancy or maximum efficiency by people like Horace Barlow, and indeed the free energy principle, which I'll be talking about later. That it's in turn is very nice, because the expectation, the average surprise or self-information, is known as entropy, which means that systems that exist and are equipped with a Markov blanket by definition will look as if they're trying to place an upper bound or suppress the natural increase in entropy. And of course, that's the holy grail of things like self-organization and synergetics in laser physics. And if I was a physiologist, it's just a statement of homeostasis, that systems that maintain themselves in a particular domain of physiological states, viable states, have a form of homeostasis. A final interpretation here, perhaps the simplest interpretation, is the interpretation that a statistician might bring to the table. What he would say is, well, look, you've been using M to denote me or my Markov blanket, but it could also be read as a model, the inside being a model of the causes of these blanket states being caused by external states. And on that reading, then this quantity becomes model evidence, where now M becomes a model, my model, I am a model. And that means this dynamics here can be read in terms of trying to maximize model evidence, sometimes described in philosophy as self-evidencing. And from that, we can understand hypotheses like the Bayesian brain hypothesis. If you're engineering, it's the objective function you would use in evidence accumulation and uncertainty quantification. If you're doing file compression, or indeed you're trying to understand neuronal networks nowadays, this would be also a description of a teleological description of things like predictive coding, which we'll come back to. So I'm going to now give you a very brief illustration of this physics of sentience that inherits from simply there being a Markov blanket that enables you to identify something that's immersed in everything else. And the way I'm going to do that is by presenting some quite old simulations now, where we wrote down the dynamics of 128 little macromolecules, each with chaotic autonomous dynamics that were coupled. They were coupled both with strong local repulsion and weak electrochemical attraction according to some standard, well, simplified sort of classical mechanics of electromagnetics. And then we just integrate the system, all these differential equations with some random fluctuations, and then simulate effectively a little primordial soup. And what you can see is that these little molecules jump around, nestling, jostling with each other, settling down to their non-equilibrium steady state. And you may be asking, well, why have I done this? Well, because I've written down the equations of motion, those flow equations, I know exactly all the influences that enable me to identify the Markov blanket. And if I can identify the Markov blanket, I can ask, is there a little creature living in the middle of this soup that's doing this Bayesian brain thing, that's behaving like a little statistician trying to model the causes of its impressions from the outside? So this is exactly the same data, the same time series, the same solution. But now I've color-coded the molecules according to this four-way partition afforded by the Markov blanket. And if you remember, the Markov blanket is just the children, the parents, and the parents of the children. And in this example here, we've identified 8 states that are the internal states in blue, that are surrounded by active states that lie underneath the sensory states that are pushed out into the external milieu that is constituted by these cyan external states. And what we have is a simulation of a little sort of viral particle or prion wriggling away with a little cilium or tail here, happily at non-equilibrium steady state. So the question now is, can we evince this statistical interpretation of their dynamics? In other words, is there anything that's going on in the inside that looks as if it's modeling or predicting stuff going on the outside? And indeed, it's very easy to find examples of this, if you like, predictive or inferential coupling between the inside and the outside that can always be seen by eye. So I've picked out an example here where what we've done is we've asked what linear mixture of the internal states best predicts physical fluctuations, here the velocity of some external states. And the predictability is color-coded, and what I've shown here are sort of time-like fluctuations in the internal states that do indeed seem to register a change in the motion of the outside, the external molecules here. So the dotted and the solid lines correspond to the actual motion of this very distal particle or molecule here, and the prediction based purely upon the inside, despite the fact that there's no direct coupling between these. All the influences are mediated vicariously through the blanket states. What one can see here, you can almost see by eye this sort of internal fluctuation. This sort of, if this was a brain, it would be an induced or evoked response in response to this movement on the outside, say a visual object moving in the visual field. But the reason I've chosen this example is if you look carefully, it's not clear whether these internal states predate or postdate the event that supposedly evoked them. So the question arises now, did the internal states cause the external states, or did the external states cause the internal states? So a heuristic example here, do the neurons in my visual cortex, are they caused by fluctuations in the outside world, or did my active states cause that optic flow when I move my eyes? So what causes what? And at this point, again, I would normally ask the audience, I'd pick on somebody in the back row this time, and ask them, is the inside causing the outside, or is the outside causing the inside? And then there would be a little bit of an argument. And then I'd ask somebody else, and then they would say, well, it's both. And then everybody would agree with them, and everybody would be absolutely right. So all we have done here is create a simulation in which a generic and emergent phenomena is clearly evident, and that phenomena is generalized synchronization, or generalized synchrony, sometimes known as synchronization of chaos. And it's, for those of you, I'm sure most of you know about this, but for those of you who don't, it was first observed by Christian Huygens, who famously observed that if you look at clocks that are suspended from the same wall or beam, then ultimately their attracting set is such that they will always come to oscillate in synchrony. So that is the only, if you like, dynamic that is allowed when you have loosely coupled systems of the kind that we're talking about. And that's all that we're seeing here. So there is no directional causality. We just got the internal states in generalized synchrony with the external states, because this is basically the joint attracting set of my little virus immersed in its primordial soup. So this is actually a drawing from Huygens with two clocks, one pendulum and another pendulum here, that we can interpret as basically the inside and the outside, the internal and the external, that are vicariously coupled through the beam, or from our point of view, the blanket states. And I like this perspective because it really highlights and foregrounds the complete symmetry here that you get from a generalized synchronization. So if you subscribe to the notion that the internal states are in some way inferring or statistically coupled to the outside states, then it has to also be true that the environment is inferring and learning about you and your internal states, which is not a silly notion when it comes to things like niche construction and the like. So we've done all the heavy lifting now. I'll just summarize what we've done so far with this sort of story from physics. The existence of a particle implies a partition of a system's systemic states into internal blanket, namely sensory and active, and external states that are hidden behind the Markov blanket from the point of view of the internal states. And because active states change but are not changed by external states, they will appear to reduce the entropy of blanket states. And this means that action will appear to maintain the structural and functional integrity of the Markov blanket. In computational chemistry, this would be known as self-assembly of a sort, or elemental sort. In the life sciences, the closest homologue is something called self-creation or autopoiesis. Internal states appear to infer the hidden causes of sensory states by increasing Bayesian model evidence and actively influence those causes. And in my world, that's usually referred to as active inference, again, emphasizing this circular causality between action and perception and the two-way traffic between the inside and the outside. This is a light break before we tell the same story from the point of view of neurobiology. So one of my postdoctoral fellows was visiting and then went to America, and he and his wife had a baby shortly after arriving in America, and his wife bought the little baby Kira a Markov blanket. So this is a Markov blanket. That's Markov there. You can buy them in America. Where else? And here's little Kira making her inferences through her special Markov blanket. Right. So as promised, I'm now going to rehearse exactly the same story, the same conceptual narrative, but using a very different language and a different perspective. So I'm now going to repeat the idea as if I was talking to psychophysicists and psychologists and neurobiologists. Effectively, what we're going to be talking about is this predictive aspect, understanding predictive coding in the context or setting of this more the physics of sentience that we've just rehearsed. So the story here probably starts with Plato, but certainly gains momentum through people like Kant and in particular Helmholtz, who we'll focus on in a second. The idea is here that sentient systems, for example, the brain, are constructive organs. They're actively constructing explanations for what's going on the outside. So in order to perceive something, you have to have it in mind, and you use that potential explanation as an account of the sensory input. So I think this point is made in a compelling way by this oil painter, 16th century oil painter, famed for doing still life, that when viewed from another perspective, evokes a very different perceptual explanation. So if previously you saw a bowl of fruit, and now you see a face, the point here is that you made that face. This is something that your brain brought to the table as an explanation for this particular pattern of input. And that's effectively the idea that was prominent in the 19th century and has become increasingly prominent in the 21st century in cognitive neuroscience, as beautifully articulated, or best articulated by Helmholtz here. For example, objects are always imagined as being present in the field of vision, as would have to be there in order to produce the same impression on the nervous mechanism. So again, is suggesting that you've got to have something in mind in the dynamics of your internal brain states before it registers the impressions on the nervous system, namely the sensory states that have been caused by something out there. And clearly that notion is very clearly related to the ideas of Richard Gregory, specifically perception as hypothesis testing, using sensory data not to extract information, but simply to test your beliefs about what caused this sensation. And this, like, almost strange inversion of perception and evidence accumulation has been used to great effect in machine learning by people like Geoffrey Hinton and Peter Dayan, who actually came up with an algorithm and architecture they call the Helmholtz machine as a formal metaphor for the Bayesian brain, borrowing from Bayesian probability theory and actually using, at least paying a formal nod to the work of Richard Feynman on solving difficult inference problems using variational free energy. Let's just come back to Helmholtz. So, this notion of producing impression on the nervous mechanism. So from our perspective, these impressions are exactly the sensory registration of external outside states on the sensory states of our Markov blanket, on our Markovian veil that separates us on the inside from the outside. So I've cartooned that in the form of this shadow. And if it is the case that just to exist, we have to do this gradient flow on model evidence, then that effectively means that to exist, will look as if I'm trying to infer the causes of these sensory shadows here. So how might one understand the brain, and in particular, brain or neuronal dynamics, as realizing this sort of fundamental inference and gradient flow? And it's actually much simpler than you might imagine. So certainly in the past decade or so, people have now understood neuronal dynamics in the brain in terms of something called predictive coding. If you're engineering, this would be akin to an extended Kalman filter. It's very simple. It just is the Helmholtz decomposition of our gradient flow that we ended up with in the first part of the talk. And I've actually replaced the log, the potential, with a free energy functional here of the blanket states and the internal states. So here's the Helmholtz decomposition, and I've just rewritten it using two other variables. The first is the solenoidal part, and the second is the gradient flow here, allowing me to make a couple of points. In this form, people in engineering will recognize this update about expected states of the world out there, state estimation, as having two parts that comprise a Kalman filter or a Bayesian filter. Basically, a prediction part that is the solenoidal or conservative part. So if I know states of the world and I know how they move, I can predict how they're going to change in the moment. And then there's an update part, which is the gradient flow. It also allows me to say that you can always write down a gradient of your potential, or in this instance, the free energy form of that potential log probability, as a prediction error. So what's a prediction error? Well, imagine we had this sensory impression, the sensory shadow on our Markov blanket or veil, and I had this internal expectation. My internal states were encoding a belief that these impressions were caused by a howling dog. And if I had a generative model or mapping that would generate from this belief the sensory impressions that I would get if my beliefs were correct, I can then compare the prediction generated by the generative model with the actual sensations and simply subtract them to produce a prediction error. And all that this equation is saying is that we can then use the prediction error to update and improve our expectations, our means, our averages, or mu here, until the prediction error is suppressed and I've destroyed my free energy gradients, or I've minimized my free energy, or maximized my log probability. Notice that in suppressing or destroying free energy gradients or resolving prediction errors, you don't actually know what the external states were. In fact, in this instance, it was actually a cat and not a dog. But that doesn't matter from the point of view of the inside. If you can get through life by explaining away all your prediction errors, job done. So that formulation of the Helmholtz decomposition, in particular the gradient flows, in terms of minimizing prediction error, provides a very simple account of action and perception in the following way. That there are two ways to minimize prediction error, and that's all that we need to do. We can either change our mind so that our predictions are made more like the sensations, or we can resample the world to make our sensations more like the predictions. And we can read these sort of dual approaches that work hand in hand to minimize prediction error as action, changing sensations by actively palpating the world, either with our visual palpation with our eyes or literally with our fingers, to sample the right kind of data, where the right kind is basically what we predicted we would sample, or we can perceive by changing our predictions, by updating our Bayesian beliefs or expectations about the causes of our sensations out there, which from a psychological perspective would be basically changing predictions to do belief updating or perception. So notice though, if I'm going to use this prediction error auxiliary or proxy for these free energy or surprise gradients, I have to be able to generate the prediction, which means I need to be able to have a model that generates from the causes the observable consequences. And clearly, in the kind of universe that we occupy, these models and the causes are deeply structured, dynamical, hierarchically structured, sometimes it is deep, have deep structure, that I've cartooned here in terms of random fluctuations in a series of external states causing my sensory states here. And if I had the model that matched the actual generation of my sensory inputs, then I can now just apply this gradient flow that I know must be in play at some level if I exist, to understand the message passing on the inside of a sentient artifact such as you and me. So this is just a cartoon of the kind of generative model that people think the brain uses, or the visual brain at least. And all it's saying really is, in order to generate some predictions, you have to be able to know the causes and derive from the causes the sensory consequences. And the example here is just basically solving a problem of the sort, please generate for me the kind of sensory data that will be sampled by visual eye movements or sampling a visual scene, hear a face. But to generate that, I have to know what I'm looking at and the dynamics and where I'm looking at it. And I can then compose and hierarchically solve these known contingencies and the way that data are actually generated to actually simulate the kind of data that we will actually sample with our, in this instance, our retina. So that's a model, a generative model mapping from causes to consequences. Of course, inference and this generalized synchrony is the reverse of the inversion of this generative model, namely perceptual inference. And that's given for free by our gradient flow, here written in the form of a Kalman filter. And what we can do is adopt exactly the same form for the inside of the brain now, where we just replace the random fluctuations with prediction errors and the external states with their expected values here. But there's one twist in terms of the functional form of this gradient flow. The prediction errors now drive the expectations. So we have sensations coming in here. They're in receipt of top-down predictions, and the prediction error then drives this to perform a better expectation. So that suggests that you would find in the brain this reciprocal coupling between hierarchical levels of representations, some of them playing the role of expectations, the other as errors, that are hierarchically coupled in terms of with descending predictions and ascending prediction errors. And that is very much like how real brains appear to be wired. I won't focus on this, but it is interesting from the point of view of people doing neurobiology, neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. This is a very apt description of large-scale hierarchical neural networks in the brain. So, very briefly, we could consider visual input coming from the retina. It would be in receipt of top-down predictions from the visual cortex. Those would generate a prediction error. Those would be passed up back to the visual cortex to revise or drive these expectations to provide a better account, thereby eliminating the prediction error. But of course, this expectation here is itself being predicted by a higher level. So there's another prediction, a second order prediction error that's being generated here, and it's driving changes in this expectation, and so on to any hierarchical depth required, until you have this sort of multi-level abstraction, or at many different levels of abstraction, explanation for this visual input. And exactly the same game can be applied to or played for other kinds of inputs. So, for example, proprioceptive input. This is the input you get from your actuators, your muscles, the degree to which they are currently stretched, or the position of some limb. So this input comes along, it can be predicted, there's a prediction error, we can revise our beliefs about where our eyes are pointing, for example. However, this is where action gets into the game. There's a much simpler, more efficient way of resolving these proprioceptive prediction errors. We can simply take the prediction error and turn it back or couple it back to the outside, to the muscle, to drive the muscle until its stretch is exactly that predicted by the top-down predictions. And what I've described here is a servo or a reflex arc in motor control theory. It's very much similar to the equilibrium point hypothesis. The story here, though, is quite simply that this is how predictions are realized actively and enable a sentient artifact to author its own sensations simply by predicting where I'm going to look next. So that's the second kind of storytelling from the point of view of neurobiology. I just want to conclude, if we have time, with a greater focus on the nature of those reflexes and beyond that actually drive our behavior. I'm going to give a very simple illustration, again using a simulation, of how far you can get just by using these proprioceptive reflexes that are trying to eliminate the prediction error, not of the visual input, but of the feeling input generated by the organs or the actuators we use to actually live in the world. Just for those of you who haven't thought about it, you can only change the world in one of two ways, either by moving a muscle or by secreting something. There is nothing else you can do to change the world. So these reflex arcs, either motor reflexes or autonomic reflexes, are the way that we act upon the world. So it's much simpler than you might think about it, if you ask those kinds of existential questions. So this illustration just picks up on a few favorite things in psychology. And I'll just mention those in passing for those people who are doing natural sciences or psychology. What we've done here is give this little generative model or equip it with basically a central pattern generator. It's based upon Volterra dynamics. And all it does is it's sort of internally, you've got this sort of autonomous dynamics. But this model has now mapped this abstract motion through some state space into Euclidean space, where the agent believes that there's an invisible point moving around. And crucially, this invisible point is attached with an invisible spring to the end of its finger. So it thinks that its finger is being pulled around by a point that's moving. So it expects to see its finger being drawn around, and it expects to feel its arm and its finger moving in concordance with these top-down predictions. So in the two modalities, we can now generate predictions of the proprioception, where my finger should be, and in the visual dimension, basically what I would see, and I would expect to see my finger moving. And indeed, when you just integrate that gradient flow that we saw on the previous slide, this predictive coding scheme, and equip it with these reflexes with the active states, you can simulate very realistic biological motion. In this instance, we've simulated handwriting of a very elemental sort. This is a nice illustration because it sort of features a lot of the hallmarks that people look for in neurophysiology. So, for example, if I look at the activity of this neuron here, or neuronal population, encoding this, if you like, abstract cause or dynamics that can be read as a central pattern generator, and I plot its activity as a position of space, we get these very specific receptive fields that look very much like something called place cells in the human brain, that they respond or activate when things are in a particular spatial configuration. Now, of course, this is unremarkable from our point of view because we know that this sensation and navigation of space is actually being generated by these cells. However, I can change the scenario basically by cutting or attenuating the proprioceptive prediction errors, but playing the same visual input to the agent. So from the agent's point of view, she thinks she's looking at somebody writing, but it's not her because she can't feel her arm moving, which means that you can now simulate somebody actually acting or observing the same action done by somebody else. And of course, from our point of view, it is not remarkable that exactly the same functional specificity and dynamics and place cell-like activity is evoked, because the generative model is perfectly fit for purpose for predicting the visual inputs, even if we're ignoring the proprioceptive inputs. And this phenomenon in the brain has been celebrated in terms of something called mirror neurons and mirror neuron systems. And it's just an emergent property of having a generative model that generates different kinds of data, some of which will control movement and some of which won't. Mathematically, that I've just sketched out the sort of computational architecture of that simulation, just to feature the role of the Markov blanket in separating inside stuff from outside stuff. So the way that you might think about this as a computer scientist, the sensory data comes in. It is then used to optimize your expectations, and we'll see in a moment that they're encoded by effectively a Bayesian belief about the external states that are hidden behind the Markov blanket through a minimization of this free energy functional here. And once we've got the right expectations or beliefs encoded by internal states, we can then use the predicted proprioceptive states to minimize our proprioceptive prediction error and drive action, and then we get the kind of simulation that we've just seen. But what I want to conclude with is another way of doing it, which is probably much closer to the way that we choose and plan our actions. And I use the word plan very specifically here because if I had the kind of generative model that included not just the contingencies and the dynamics in the outside world causing my sensory impressions, but also the consequences of my action in that world, then I can now think about how would I act in order to minimize my prediction error or my free energy after acting. So this is an outcome that is not at this stage available because I haven't yet secured the outcomes of acting. And that leads to a very different sort of computational architecture, apt for describing creatures and particles that plan. So this would not work for a virus, but it would work for you. So in this architecture, exactly the same perceptual inference ensues, as we'll see in the next couple of slides, via a minimization of this prediction error or free energy functional of the sensory states of the Markov blanket. But now we're going to use our beliefs about states in the world to ask what's the most likely action if the most likely action minimizes the free energy in the future or minimizes prediction errors in the future. And I've written this out in a particular way, which I want to unpack for you in the next slide, that reveals a surprising answer in the sense that there are very definitive ways of acting that enable you to anticipate the kind of reduction in prediction errors or maximization of value in the future that provide the basis for planning of a very generic sort, but also Bayes optimal sort. So let me just explain why I've written complexity and accuracy, risk and ambiguity down here. So what we're doing now, this is the last slide that has any sort of heavy lifting associated with it. I'm now writing out in full what this free energy is that has previously just been associated with the negative log probability of some outcome. And effectively, it's what's called a bound approximation to the negative log probability of some sensory outcome here. So in statistics, this is called a log evidence. This is a bound because this quantity here can never be less than 0. And therefore, this free energy constitutes an upper evidence bound or an upper log evidence bound. In machine learning, they use a negative that called a lower evidence bound or an elbow evidence lower bound. And the key thing about this functional is it's very tractable. So this is Richard Feynman's contribution, that you can actually evaluate this very, very easily. It's not quite the evidence we're chasing or the surprise that we're chasing, but it's very close to it because it's always greater than. Therefore, if I minimize the free energy, then I effectively am guaranteed, depending upon the quality of this bound, to minimize my log evidence or maximize my marginal likelihood on my model evidence here. The reason I've written this out in full for you is to make 2 points. That this function is a function of the belief about the external states that is encoded by the internal states. This is where the Bayesian part gets into the game. The second reason I've written it out in full is that it's by switching around these 2 terms here. I can interpret this approximate bound to the quantity I know my gradient flows should be optimizing. In terms of 2 quantities that a statistician would understand. And these quantities are accuracy and complexity. So while I'm trying to minimize free energy or minimize prediction error, which I have to do if I exist, then I look as if I am trying to maximize accuracy, namely the log of the probability of the sensory consequences of some external causes, expected under my beliefs about those causes, whilst at the same time doing that in the simplest way possible by minimizing the complexity. And that follows because this complexity measure is what's called a decayal divergence or relative entropy between my beliefs after seeing some data and my beliefs before seeing the data, posterior and priors in Bayesian rhetoric. Literally, the degree to which some data changes my mind. The more I have to change my mind, the more complex my belief updating, and effectively the less likely it is that that's the best explanation. The key thing is I can work out this free energy in the future if I knew how I was going to act by taking the average over the consequences of the outcomes of that action. And in that setting, we can talk about the expected free energy, the expected complexity, the expected accuracy, the expected bound, and the expected log evidence. And all of these things actually have a very simple interpretation that already exist as objective functions and imperatives in choice behavior and in economics. So let me just briefly take you through this, because I think it's, this, if you like, symmetry between the free energy and that consequence upon an action, I think is very beautiful. Also makes a lot of sense in terms of different ways of splitting up what is good behavior and what are good beliefs. So I've labeled them intrinsic and extrinsic value. Why? Well, let's just drill down on the intrinsic value and ignore the extrinsic value, which, if you remember, is just a score of the degree to which some certain sensory states are attractive, either their surprise or the negative surprise, their value. So what is this expression? It's a relative entropy, or technically a KL divergence, between my beliefs about hidden states in the world, consequent upon an action, when I can see the sensory consequences of the action relative to before I've seen them. So in effect, it's an information gain. In the visual search literature, it's known as Bayesian surprise, but we can think of this effectively as the amount of information I have gained if I pursue, or will gain if I pursue this action. Alternatively, it can be thought of in terms of how much uncertainty have I resolved if I were to look over there, for example. Another way of looking at this is in terms of Horace Barlow's mutual information. This expression is just the KL divergence between, or the mutual information between the causes and consequences, conditioned, I expect, following a particular action that produces those external causes and the sensory consequences there. If I now were to take a particular uncertainty out of the game by saying, well, let's ignore ambiguity. Let's ignore this term here. Well, so what does that mean? Well, it just means if the ambiguity is expected accuracy, it just means that accuracy doesn't matter anymore in the sense that I can see everything definitively with no ambiguity. So all my sensory states are reporting exactly all the external states. There's no ambiguity given my sensory states about the external states. And that leaves this thing here, which is another KL divergence, but this time we're trying to minimize it. And in this instance, trying to minimize the beliefs or the predictions about external states, or the divergence between those consequences or outcomes I predict and those a priori I prefer or think will happen. So it's essentially choosing actions that minimize the divergence between what I anticipate and what I prefer or find attractive. And in engineering, this is known as KL control, standing in for Kullback-Leibler divergence. In economics, it's known as risk-sensitive control. And then finally, if I ignore the uncertainty consequent upon an action, and I ignore the ambiguity, I'm left with this term, but because external states are sensory states, this is just the extrinsic value. It's just what we've been talking about in terms of value. It's just those a priori preferred states I find myself attracted to that are characteristic of me and define me. And therefore, I am going to take those actions that bring about those states with the greatest expected value or utility. So I'm going to close now with an example of this kind of action as planning or planning as inference that rests upon this expected free energy, which you can read if you're in the visual search and neurosciences as basically the salience. How attractive, what is the epistemic affordance of looking over there as opposed to looking over there? So literally here, if I were only able to sample with my eyes a very limited field of vision, a foveal sample here of this image, how much uncertainty would I resolve if I thought that this was the cause, this object was the cause of my local sensory visual sampling? And I can work that out mathematically in terms of the expected free energy, and I can repeat that for all possible placements of this little circle here and create what's called a salience map, which is just effectively a negative expected free energy map. And these provide plausible, very plausible explanations for where people actually do deploy their action in terms of visual sampling of the world, where they choose to go and visually palpate and get information from the visual world that resolves uncertainty about what caused that. And you can simulate that. I won't exhaust you by taking you through it. It's the same kind of generative model that we talked about before. We simply integrate this model, now equipped with a consequence of the future encoded by this expected free energy, conditioned upon different actions, where the actions in this instance is looking over here, or looking over here, or looking over here. And when we simulate this kind of active vision, that is driven purely by the need to resolve uncertainty, we can get some very plausible behavior. So in this synthetic example, this little agent has a very simple universe. She lives in a universe where there's just a face, and a face can either be upright, sideways, or inverted. But she can only sample by looking around the visual scene very small patches, again corresponding to a foveal representation that we've seen before over here. So she has to choose very carefully where to look next in order to maximize information gain, to disambiguate or discriminate among these three plausible hypotheses that could explain this sequence of sensory data, but that she is authoring because she's in charge of where to actually look. And this is how the synthetic agent behaves. This is where she's looking. This is the updated salience or expected free energy map that interestingly changes with time, because the expected free energy is all about reducing uncertainty, and uncertainty reduces with time as you sample more information. And hence you get this sort of characteristic sampling of informative features, usually around the nose and the eyes. And here are the posterior beliefs of this synthetic agent, and she is correctly identifying that the actual sample generating these actively sampled visual inputs is an upright face, and she becomes increasingly confident about that as time goes on, and the other two hypotheses are suppressed. So nicely illustrating the sort of evidence accumulation that is driven in a Bayes-optimal way, sometimes referred to as active learning or optimal Bayesian design, to get the right kind of data that resolve uncertainty, that ensure the minimization of this surprise or free energy functional that looks as if she is building confident beliefs about the causes of her actively sampled sensations. So that's probably better summarized by Helmholtz, who more articulate than any of us, with the following quote: "Each movement we make by which we alter the appearance of objects should be thought of as an experiment designed to test whether we have understood correctly the invariant relations of the phenomena before us, that is, their existence in definite spatial relations." And with that, it just remains for me to thank those people who whose ideas I've been talking about, and of course, to thank you for your attention. Thank you very much indeed.
Yep, thank you very much, Professor Friston, for the presentation. And I believe we now have some time for questions and answers. So to the audience, if you're interested in raising a question, you could type it to the chat, or you could just raise your hand or just unmute yourself. And then I could see 1, 2 hands raised. So let me try and figure it out. So sorry, let me find out where the hand, or maybe just one of you, maybe just unmute yourself, and then I think
we've got Eddie and Suzanne. I can see.
Okay, yeah. So maybe, yeah, got it. So maybe we start with Eddie. If you could unmute yourself, then.
Thank you, Professor, for this very fascinating talk. I've been wondering about the last part of your talk was very information dense, and I was wondering about just one thing, is that when you mentioned risk and ambiguity, I wonder if, suppose that an agent is confronted with both an environment of high risk and high ambiguity, what decides what the agent would do?
Well, that's an excellent question. The quantity that sort of, if you like, resolves the dialectic between do you minimize risk or minimize ambiguity is the precision of your prior beliefs. So if you have very, very precise prior beliefs that these are the outcomes that a creature like me should encounter, these could be physiological, they could be blood, they could be blood osmolality or temperature, or they could be economic. I'm going to get this amount of money if I choose that job as opposed to that job, or place that bet as opposed to that bet. If you have very precise beliefs about the consequences of your action in terms of these prior preferences, then that amplifies the contribution of the risk. So any departure from those precise beliefs is quantified by that KL divergence, or the risk, and that now comes to dominate over the ambiguity. So what one tends to see usually is that when you're in an unfamiliar environment, usually all the uncertainty and the ambiguity is usually the dominant imperative for weighting the best action. But as you become familiar with your environment and you work out how things work, the epistemic part, the intrinsic motivation, if you like, or the intrinsic uncertainty resolving contribution to the expected free energy starts to decline. And as it declines, say, for example, the ambiguity, literally it passes the threshold offered by the risk, and then suddenly the risk starts to dominate. So you get this natural Bayes optimal progression from exploration to exploitation, as the ambiguity-like information-seeking part of the expected free energy is resolved and gives way to the more pragmatic utilitarian risk part of the expected free energy, because all of these depend upon beliefs, and your beliefs are changing as you learn about the environment. So it's an excellent question, and indeed you can start to think about well, what kinds of priors or preferences would be held with great precision, and it's usually those that are of a sort of innate subpersonal physiological sort. Existentially, you have to keep certain things in bounds. So there are certain things you are very, very confident that you are unlikely to act towards, such as being at minus 20 degrees centigrade, or being underwater, or flying, or there are all sorts of states of being which a priori your brain is wired to know you don't go there, you stay there. But there are other states of being which you may not have a priori exactly the same prior about. So choosing which mixture of natural sciences to do before, then it's much more driven by the epistemic affordances. There's no utilitarian prior there, and then it's all about what will I learn if I do that, what will happen if I do that, and that's scored by this salience term, or this epistemic term. When you apply that maths, that KL divergence, to contingencies and the parameters of a generative model, then that becomes novelty. So you start to become sensitive to novelty. Just know what would happen if I did that. That becomes in itself now attractive in terms of minimizing the expected free energy. And young people, of course, love all that. They respond very, very sensitively, because they want to find out what happens when you do that. Old people like me know. So we're much more on the pragmatic side, and probably wouldn't go bungee jumping to the extent that you would.
Thank you so much. I do have a follow-up question on this, but should I go for this follow-up, or should I ask others to go first?
Yes.
So it's just but I do not understand about the part where you mentioned. To phrase this question in another way, so would people have to minimize reward prediction errors as well, because those reward things which we prefer were not expected?
Yes, the reward prediction error story is absorbed into this more general construct through effectively the prior preferences that we were just talking about. So if you just think more generally, what are the different ways in which I can minimize my expected surprise? First of all, if you're an information theorist, what is expected surprise? Well, it's called entropy. So what is entropy in an anthropomorphic setting? Well, it's uncertainty. which means that everything we do is in the surface of resolving uncertainty. But there's a special way in which you can resolve uncertainty, which is by basically avoiding those things you find extremely surprising. So these would have a high cost function or a very large negative reward. So one way of avoiding expected surprise is to avoid states of being that have an exceedingly low probability given I am me, like being in pain. So you can look at reward really as the complement of a cost function, and that cost function basically scores the implausibility of being in that state, given you are that kind of creature. So from that point of view, then you can now understand the minimization of reward prediction errors in this setting. In fact, the story is a little bit more complicated than that. So if you worked with Wolfram Schultz and his friends in Cambridge, there's a slightly more, you have to unpack this in terms of beliefs as opposed to simple, kinds of reward prediction errors you might find in the Scholar-Wagner models. Interestingly, it's probably more about the reduction of uncertainty about whether I'll get my reward, which is the thing that's driving, we think of as a classical reward prediction error. But that's a slight nuance to the story, which just depends upon the way that you conceive of the belief updating and the planning. But to put it simply, basically, if, your reward prediction error of the sort reported, say, by dopamine, in this setting, looks very much as if it is the realization, I know what's going to happen to me. I see something out there, I see a sign, I'll get a fruit drop, and I know I'm going to experience some nice, familiar, unsurprising outcome. I'm going to taste something, I'm going to receive some money. So it's really the resolution of uncertainty that is afforded by seeing some rewarding cue that is reflected in this instance, the precision of beliefs about what I should be doing. And that seems to be an apt explanation for dopaminergic responses. Was that clear? I mean, it's a really interesting question, and people have written papers about this. So it's difficult to give you a straightforward answer. But all of the the reinforcement learning and reward prediction error, they're all internally consistent. But the formulation that I've been talking about, the active inference, is slightly more general because it puts uncertainty center stage, and reward just becomes part of that, basically by avoiding very surprising outcomes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, now we maybe have question for the remaining audience. So maybe Susan, if you'd like to raise a question.
Yeah, hi. I think my question is a lot more basic, and I'm a bit worried as a biologist here tonight that I don't even know how much more basic. But it's about your Markov blanket at the start, when you were you had all the parents and the children and the grandchildren, I guess, and you were defining your external states and your active states and your sensory states. That those definitions, as far as I could tell, were very dependent on the fact that each parent only affects the generation below it and never affects for example, the grandchildren directly. How does, as a biologist, that just, seems unlikely in any system? Is there a way to define systems like that, or?
Yeah. So that's an excellent question, very astute of you. Yeah, the graphic I used did have this simplifying aspect that everything had downward causation in one direction. So it's a kind of causal influences you might use when that downward arrow was the arrow of time, for example. The past can only influence the future. But in a real world setting and in application, you're absolutely right that there is no, the direction that there is no cascading down to children of children of children of children. All you need is this rule that is probably summarized in the simplest way in the following sense, that external states can only influence themselves and sensory states, and internal states can only influence themselves and active states. Otherwise, all bets are off. So if you have that particular, if you like, sparsity of coupling, then that is sufficient to establish a Markov blanket. Okay. Yep. So what that basically means is you can get different sort of biological artifacts or systems that can look like the following: that you have internal states covered by active states, covered by sensory states, covered by external states. Now, notice that in this instance, that rule is complied with in the sense that the external states can only influence the sensory states. They can't get to the active states because they're beneath the skin, as it were, like our muscles. And similarly, the external states can't get to the sensory states because the sensory states are hiding behind the muscles or the active states. So that rule is fulfilled. But that you get other kinds of other conditional dependencies and influences come into play when you think about more complicated systems like us. So, for example, because we can effectively move with bypassing the sensory states. So on a simple-minded sort of picture of this, moving my finger around is not enacted by my sensory states. I mean, practically, in fact, my muscles are still underneath my skin, but ignoring that, mathematically, you can actually get active states coupling directly to the outside. You can act directly on the world, not necessarily through the sensory states. And in a similar vein, and in some instances, the sensory states can themselves act upon the external states. So it's a very astute question, and it's actually an area that is now currently hotly debated in the philosophy and maths literature as to the exact specification of a Markov blanket, and in particular, what's the relationship between the dynamical coupling. So you will at some point, I think, come across loosely coupled oscillators as things like Kuramoto models, as models of neuronal dynamics in neuroscience. So it is the loosely coupled aspect here frames the problem in terms of dynamical systems theory, basically equations of motion, where one state can be coupled to the motion of another state or not. And therefore, you can write down the sparsity of that coupling, the loose coupling, which is basically a sparse coupling, and thereby define the sort of sparsely coupled or loosely coupled oscillator models of dynamics, which are all sorts of interesting properties. The trick is, how do you get from that dynamical or dynamical systems theory description to the statistical description in terms of probability distributions, which is where the Markov blanket is actually defined, because it's defined in conditional independencies. So that's quite a recent field of inquiry and begs all sorts of interesting questions, which you have just touched upon and which you've elicited a very long-winded answer from me because it's so interesting.
Thank you so much.
I think we have Salvador, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hi, yes. I also wanted to ask about self-organization. So it strikes me that biological self-organization is sort of particularly fascinating because it's this very complex process, but it ends up with organisms that have some very defined shape. And this shape seems to be in some meaningful way an attractor or an energy minimum. And that, to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the organism, if you perturb the organism away from that attractor, it will revert back to it. So I'm thinking about something like a salamander being able to regrow its tail. So we've known since Alan Turing's work in the 1950s that chemical reaction diffusion systems are capable of some level of self-organization. They're capable of arranging themselves into these interesting kind of maybe biological-looking patterns. But I'm wondering if you might speak about whether you think that biological systems have some information processing capability that just these simple reaction diffusion systems don't have, that enable them to form more interesting and more specific patterns, or if you think that in principle, reaction fusion systems are capable of generating complex or arbitrary patterns in the same way that the biological systems can.
Yeah, a great question. Again, you'll find the answers, in multiple recent papers, asking, well, what does the notion of a Markov blanket bring to the table that would enable me to ask questions? What's the difference between a small particle and a virus? What's between a virus and a worm? What's between a worm and a cat and a human? I think you properly introduced the sort of Turing's kind of system or pattern formation systems. So the BZ reaction would be sort of the poster child of this sort of reaction diffusion like pattern formation, and that is exactly the non-equilibrium steady state that I was talking about before. So the very turbulence you get in the BZ reaction, the whirls of activity, is the solenoidal flow that defines the breaking detailed bounds that makes a steady state in a non-equilibrium steady state that has to have all of these reaction diffusion and nonlinear aspects to it. Is that enough to understand life? I think not. I think you can certainly create non-equilibrium steady states of the kind that Turing might have tried to mathematically study in terms of the local interactions, and again the loose coupling, the sparse coupling that leads to this particular kind of pattern formation. But what you're overlooking is there is no Markov blanket apart from the dish. So the active inference in the free energy principle says, well, that's great, but where did the dish come from? And what physics allow you to understand how the integrity of the dish is conserved? So it's the dish that contains the BZ reaction and the Turing pattern formation, which is really the secret to, I think, understanding life and cellular organisms and why you get multicellular organisms. So it's all about this sort of autopoietic maintenance of the distinction between me and not me as a cell or a person. Because if I lose that Markov blanket, I literally bleed into, diffuse, dissipate, decay, die, all the good D words, because there is no longer any distinction between me and my external milieu. So it's all about keeping that Markov blanket. So I think it goes beyond just non-equilibrium steady state. But you're absolutely right. It is a non-equilibrium steady. There has to be a non-equilibrium steady state in order for there to be a Markov blanket. Why? Well, that's the answer to the previous question. If the Markov blanket is defined in terms of probability distributions, then the probability distribution only exists if there's an attracting set, and the attracting set only exists if there's a non-equilibrium steady state solution. So they all go hand in hand, really. And then you get onto a whole host of questions. Well, what's the difference between a virus and a vegetarian? And I think that there are real simple answers to that, and I think it's all in from the point of view of the heuristics of the structure of the implicit generative model. It's just the difference between creatures of biological or biotic self-organization that can plan and cannot plan, which from the point of view of the generative model is just it being equipped by evolution, which is itself a Bayesian model selection or free energy minimizing process. It's been equipped with the generative model of the consequences of its own action. So it becomes an agent as opposed to just doing it by reflexes. So, you could describe a thermostat as conforming to active inference, but a thermostat doesn't plan. It resolves all its prediction errors by changing the temperature of the room, but it doesn't plan, whereas you and I plan. We have a notion of counterfactual futures amongst which we select in accord mathematically with the sort of mixture of risk and ambiguity of the expected free energy. So I think there are lots of different artifacts and phenotypes around, right from small particles through to human beings, and they're all good solutions in the sense of them being viable non-equilibrium steady state solutions with a Markov blanket. But there are certain special systems that have much more complicated, sophisticated and deep generative models deep into the future that enable them to plan. If you wanted to sort of, if you're a physicist, you'd really want to be able to measure that. And you'd be asking me, well, how do I measure that particular kind of looking into the future? I don't think anybody really knows the answer. Well, I'm sure people do know the answer, but I don't know anybody knows the answer at the moment. But my guess is it's going to be in the information geometry, the information length, the number of different probabilistic configurations you pass through as you're slowly unfolding your plan. So this gets us into the world of information geometries, information entropies, and basically how fine-grained is your representational capacity, and specifically how many different belief states will I pass through in executing a trajectory or a path or a plan into the future. My suspicion is that there's enormous variation in artifacts that exist, i.e. have Markov blankets. Most of them are going to be biotic. You could argue that a stone is, but a stone, strictly speaking, doesn't actually have a non-equilibrium steady-state solution, because ultimately it will get worn down. So I would imagine nearly all of the kinds of systems we're talking about are biotic at some level. And then there are really interesting questions about the different kinds of solutions that they've found, in accord with in accord with the minimization surprise, either by planning or not by planning. Is that what you meant?
Yes, that was fascinating. Thank you.
I think we also have a question from the chat. So it is avoiding high uncertainty about outcomes formally equivalent to maximizing the extent by which agents can compress information about their surroundings? If so, do you think agent behavior can be motivated from an information compression perspective, or is this just a restatement of entropy minimization?
Excellent question again. That's a very informed question. Everything is absolutely right until the last word, which is maximization. So there are different perspectives on the information theoretic formulation of this kind of this description of sentient behavior and implicitly belief updating. And I'll just make the point that via things like Landauer's principle and the Zielinski equality, whatever you say about the informational complexity also counts thermodynamically. So the more complex your belief updating or your trajectory or your inference, the more electricity or energy it's going to consume. So it has real practical engineering thermodynamic consequences. So what's one way of looking at this imperative to minimize the complexity? So let's not worry about so much the expected complexity, which was the risk. Let's just go back to vanilla free energy, variational free energy. It just has two parts, the accuracy and the complexity. When we want to minimize free energy, we want to minimize the complexity. What's one way to minimize the complexity? It's to compress your explanation for those data, to find the simplest and smallest number of degrees of freedom necessary to account for these particular data whilst not losing any accuracy. And indeed, there are, if you like, formulations of variational free energy that are cast in terms of minimum description length and minimum message length, which celebrate under discrete state space models and the laws of large numbers exactly the notion that the good explanation is the simplest one. It's the compressed one. So there's a really profound relationship between compression and inference, good inference, to the extent you could actually say one is just the other. If you want to pursue that, you can pursue that from through rate distortion theorems, through Kolmogorov complexity, through to Slomov induction. And currently, I think it's called AIXI or XIAI, if you want to Wikipedia it. So this is about universal computation cast in terms of compression and minimum description lengths. Just one other little thing here. Predictive coding, which if you're in the cognitive sciences or doing neurosciences, you'll probably be even being lectured about nowadays. I mean, 10 years ago, it was not mainstream. Now it's basically center stage in cognitive neuroscience as the best metaphor for the working brain. But predictive coding was actually invented in the 1950s, and it was invented as a audio file compression scheme. So predictive coding, as an engineer would know it, is just the compression of information in the most efficient way possible. The reason the minimization of entropy was wrong is that the other way of writing that free energy is in terms of an expected energy and an entropy, where the entropy is of your beliefs. And in fact, you want to maximize the entropy of your beliefs in accord with James's maximum entropy principle. So it's not minimizing the entropy, you want to maximize the entropy, which is the other side of the coin of minimizing the complexity or the message length. So they're all very internally consistent, but sort of because you're moving terms around, they afford slightly different perspectives of the same underlying imperative, which is to minimize the free energy. So you can look at James's maximum entropy principle as basically a minimum free energy principle, where you've committed to particular constraints under which you maximize entropy, and those constraints are afforded by the accuracy that comes from the generative model. Or you could do it the other way around. You could say that the free energy principle is a special case of James's maximum entropy principle, where the constraints are to minimize the expected energy under a particular generative model. But so they're all beautifully and rather simply related if you get into them. Was that a good answer? Compression is very important.
Justin says yes, thank you.
Okay. Well, of course, he was chatting, wasn't he? He wasn't on the video. I was looking around for nodding, but
I think, Suzanne, do you have another follow-up question? I can see that you've got your hand up.
Yeah, if that's all right. I was hoping to kind of ask a broader question, as well, if that's all right. So I don't know, would it be fair to describe you as kind of a physicist making a lot of predictions about biological systems? And if so, can I ask kind of, what your experience has been as kind of coming from the field of physics with this? I will admit, I missed a lot of the maths today as a biologist. I did some first year physics. I recognize some of the, symbols, but, you're coming from physics and you're making these predictions about fairly complex biological systems. Can I ask kind of, I don't know, what's been your experience doing that? What's been the reception you've gotten? How has that dynamic been?
Well, in fact, I did natural sciences as a medic at Keyes.
Oh, really?
So I'm not a physicist, but I did do 1B physics at go out to the Cavendish in my final year. And I actually chose to go to Cambridge so I could do this. So I did psychology 1B and physics, psychology part 2 and physics 1B in the final year. So if you are asking how can you build your early training to position yourself to make formal contributions in psychology or the life sciences that matter, by formal I mean something that can be coded up or written down analytically that has a precise form, then you're in a very good position to do this if you do natural sciences, because you've got that right mixture just to provide a broad base for your education. So I personally then went on to train in medicine. I was interested in the brain, so I specialized in psychiatry, and then I got back into, as soon as I could, the research, which now would be known as computational neuroscience. When I was your age, it would have been known as mathematical psychology, but now it's computational neuroscience. But one thing, that dynamic, I'm answering the question from the point of view of encouraging you to be as eclectic as you can while you're young. So just hoover up all the different ways of articulating the same problem, either mathematically or in philosophy or in biochemistry, whatever you can. Is because they're usually describing the same things but just using a different language. So if you can see the links, it makes your job a lot easier. I do repeat though, if you're going to make a difference really in designing medical equipment or creating the next best apps in sliced bread, or becoming an entrepreneur in finance, you probably do have to be able to code. You don't need to do the maths though. So the people who use the kind of physics that I've been talking about, this physics of sentience in silico, using as observation models of real patients and people's behavior, or as proof of principle, are usually psychologists. So they don't actually have the grounding in the maths, but they do have a good understanding of the way things work and sense making and experimental design and how to carve nature at its joints. And that is important when you're building these things, because you have to start off with the generative model. So what I'm saying to you, you don't need to rush off and do a maths course at Milton Keynes in the evenings. You can get away with an intuitive physics, an intuitive maths. And it's very much a see one, teach one, do one kind of thing. And I'll just close by saying that none of the physics that I learned at the Cavendish in in-person supervision in the good old days have I ever used in later life. It's all come from Wikipedia. But having done that, having invested a few months or years of my life just making sure I didn't forget, learning all the sort of basic physics, it gives you a confidence that you can go through the Wikipedia foraging much more quickly. And even if you don't quite understand it, you knew that if you spent another weekend, you would understand it. So you just make the shortcut and assume that they're right. So it's worthwhile investing, but do not expect to ever use some of the stuff you're learning now in later life, because you will forget it by the time you actually have to use it. Is that what you meant by about the dynamic? There are other dynamics about how do physicists talk to biologists. There's a whole set of really interesting institutions internationally and in the UK. In the UK, there's actually something called the UK Physics of Life Society. And when you get older, they may have good PhD studentships, and if they don't even now, they may have good seminars and webinars exactly for people who want to put physical sciences together with biological sciences, in a way that matters.
Well, that was an absolutely fascinating answer. Thank you so much for your time tonight. It's been really interesting.
We have, oh, actually, sorry, that's a clapping hand. I think
everybody's tired now.
I was, Professor, I wonder if you are tired, because I actually do have one question that I think, you may find interesting as well. I wonder if you have an answer to whether we have conscious access to free energy. Like, what part of our subjective experience do we know, what our current level of free energy is?
Yeah, again, another excellent question, which is not a short question. So I'm going to give you I'll try and give you a very quick answer. Again, this is the kind of thing that you will see people writing and shouting about in the neurophilosophy literature at the moment. From my perspective, the kind of consciousness you're talking about requires a sense of self, but in my world, any sense making is just basically has to be part of the generative model. So what you're saying is, above and beyond biotic or biological systems that can plan, so they have a temporal depth, they have a notion of the future and the consequences of their action, which makes them into agents. They actually now start to have an additional hypothesis: I am an agent, and that this provides a simple explanation for everything that's going on below in their deep or hierarchical generative models. So that even beyond, let's say birds, that there may be special kinds of creatures like you and me that not only can we plan, but we know we are planning, and we can contextualize that planning because we recognize that we are a thing. So then we talk about minimal self models. And then you have to ask the question, why would the extra complexity cost of having an extra layer or level of a generative model that actually has, I am a thing, and I am happy, or I am sad, or I am frightened, or I'm in different intentional states and physiological states as well. You have to ask us, why would you want that, and how would it provide a more accurate account of all the data that you have to explain? And it can do that simply by simplifying the model, by picking out commonalities, in the sense, for example, that there's a correlation between, say, me seeing a predator and my heart rate increasing in the extraceptive and interoceptive domain. And only if I realize that has a common cause, like it's me being predated, can I provide a simpler explanation, as opposed to having two separate explanations for the visual and the heart rate sensation. And it may be that the emergence of it's me underwrites a sense of self and selfhood and the kind of consciousness I think that you're talking about. But this is pure speculation. No one's built a conscious artifact, to my knowledge, at this stage, because it would require a very deep generative model.
That's really enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the fascinating talk and the brilliant answers to our questions. I think maybe we should leave it there. I don't think anyone else has any questions.
I think everybody wants their tea now, don't they? After a long day's lectures.
Yeah.
It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you very much. Wonderful questions as well. Very, very stimulating.
Thank you very much. Yansheng, maybe we can end the stream there.
Yes. Okay, the stream has been ended.